ask questions of our speaker today, and you can also use the chat. I am recording this session, and we are using auto transcription for our closed captions today. So there may be a few words that it doesn't quite pick up. I'm going to try and put those in the chat for you for clarification. We do have a code of conduct for our online events, and I'm going to read that for you now. We aim to welcome, value and listen to the broad range of exchanges that take place during our online events. We cherish diverse participation and encourage everyone to be respectful of different cultural practices, attitudes and beliefs. Barber Home does not tolerate harassment of any form, any derogatory language, personal attacks and threats of violence, unwelcome sexual content, racist content or disruptive behaviour. As a team, we reserve the right to remove any attendees from events who we feel are not respecting this environment. We thank you for your cooperation today. So the Barber Institute of Fine Arts is the art gallery, principal art collection, and the original concert hall for the University of Birmingham. It's housed in a small purpose-built Grade 1 listed Art Deco building. It's widely recognised as one of the finest small art galleries in Europe. The Barber's collection, displayed in 4 main gallery spaces, includes paintings, works on paper, sculpture, coins, and many other art objects. It's perhaps best known for its major French 19th century paintings, including world-class impressionist masterpieces by artists including Manet, Monet, Renoir, and Degas. The gallery boasts beautiful Renaissance panel paintings and key canvases by Baroque Italian and Dutch and Flemish masters. The collection is enhanced by a year-round programme of exciting temporary exhibitions. And this is a Barber Home event, and it's part of our Barber Home series, which engages audiences with our public programme during a time of no physical interaction with the gallery. It enables the Barber to remain open as a place for people to engage with ideas and creativity inspired by the collection. To introduce our speaker today, Jon Sleigh is a learning officer, learning curator, and an art history writer. He works nationally freelance as a specialist in fine art engagement with a diverse portfolio of art institutions, museums, heritage sites across the UK. Clients include the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, the National Archives, Historic Royal Palaces, Art Fund, the V&A, the Government Art Collection, DCMS, and the Arts Council Collection. Prior to this, Jon worked for the Birmingham Museums Trust, Arts Council Collection, in 1 round of acclaimed ACE Natural Partners programme. He produces, delivers, and consults on art engagement, and Jon has built a national reputation for innovation, applied ethics, and delivery of projects reflecting inclusive futures. He has a passion for challenging underrepresented narratives and co-producing with communities to deliver their lived experience to artworks for advocacy. I'm going to hand over to you now, Jon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, and a huge hello to everybody at home. I'm aware that we've got lots of different audiences in the room today. We've got some people joining us as part of the Fringe Festival for Art History 2021. We've got people joining us from Birmingham University, and we've got art lovers from the Barber Institute of Fine Art joining us as well. So a big hello and a welcome to everybody. Today, I'm looking to explore 2 pieces of art that I find so deeply emotive and moving when I consider the subject of ageism and the proliferation of ageism within our culture and our society. I would argue is extraordinary. What I seek to do in this session is create a space where we can productively challenge prejudice that comes up and find nuance, light, darkness, joy, sorrow within pieces that depict aging and or the elderly. The presumption that the experience of aging is a 2-dimensional force to be captured in artwork, I think could be really, really dangerous. And the Barber Institute of Fine Art has got a wealth of a collection that we can explore that with. But I've narrowed it down to 2 pieces in the collection that I feel really passionate about. So during the session, I'm going to be exploring those pieces, ideas, art readings around them, and some of the history and the research to support it. My plan is to do the first piece and then open the floor if you've got any questions for me or any comments or emotions that you'd like to share, in which case please do pop them in the Q&A, and my lovely co-host Rebecca will be able to pick them up for you, and I'll throw back to her when it's time. Then I'll move on to the second piece. Then we'll have our final round where we share ideas, see where we're at, and hopefully within this space we can create together a learning environment that is warm and caring, and a space where we can challenge narratives with discourse and kindness. And ageism, I think, is a really important topic by which to do so. So I'm going to share my screen. Art that defies ageism. The artwork in the collection is incredibly useful for doing so. One of the first pieces that I think of and comes to mind when I think about fairly overt ageism in terms of the depiction of the elderly is in a nearby collection of Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and it's a piece called Old Woman Pouring Tea. Now, this isn't to be derogatory towards this piece at all. I think this piece is really useful. I think it's really beautiful. However, for me, there is a larger narrative at play here about the depiction of the elderly. And that depiction is to be cute, to be adorable, to be sweet, to be innocent, to be unassuming, to be not threatening, to just be very, very wholesome. And that projected attitude, that projected expectation societally, that I would argue that is imposed upon people that are aging, I think is quite extraordinary, and it becomes fossilized in art, whether our regional collections or our national collections. We are so used to seeing the trope of the adorable elderly that we've grown up with it. It's inescapable almost in artwork. And I think this image, for example, has been reproduced in various different forms and in different guises by different people across a multitude of forms of biscuit tins, Christmas cards, greeting cards, advertisements, mass media. The idea and the presumption that this lady is adorable, wholesome, and unproblematic is problematic in itself for me. And we can explore that in terms of this image. So we've got a lady in what appears to be a cottage or a rural setting or a very cozy domestic environment. And she's laid out a tea for herself. She's either having a tea party with and by herself or with her cat. It's very wholesome. The china is beautifully laid out. The tablecloth is out there. She looks traditionally how we would expect the stereotype of someone elderly to be as a Victorian. Hair parted, round glasses, rosy cheeks. She's well fed. She's immaculately clean. She is incredibly wholesome. She's mid-activity. There is a sense of contentment and warmth about this piece. It is very deliberately inviting and wholesome, and it wraps around you in terms of the cuteness of this character and this scene. It is designed and sets out from the offset, I would argue, to be absolutely adorable. It is cute with a capital C. And I would challenge you to ask yourself, how many times have you seen this depiction of the elderly? How many times have you seen an image that looks this way? Because for me, it's so pervasive. It's not necessarily that it's incredibly negative or hurtful, but from the perspective of ageism, it is really dangerous and really damaging because it projects a two-dimensional version of what the elderly or to age is, which is inherently cute and unproblematic. I don't get any sense of problems in this lady's world, for example. I don't see any social strife. I don't see any dilemma. I don't see any nuance in terms of mental health. I see she's very well fed. She is presumably prosperous enough to be having the time to have a tea party with herself or the cat so that she can afford the tea, that there is no economy at play, that world wars, social structures, changing dynamics, loneliness, isolation isn't at play in this because it's very, very wholesome. I think it's dangerous to assume. The fact that she's having the tea party with herself or the cat is a statement in itself, I would argue. But exploring the narrative that we grow up with in art and the media that is all around us, that the only digestible form of understanding and seeing aging is that it's cute and adorable and nice and safe is very, very misleading, because for me, that denies a sense of lived experience, the nuance of life, and the capability that we can express and do express in later life, to have nuance, to have varying states of emotion and ideas and wants and desires and needs. All of that is reduced in this stereotype for me. And I think that's one of the things I would like to challenge. One of the first pieces that leaps out to me in the collection, and is often, I would suggest, overlooked in terms of the wealth of work that you've got on the walls, the huge names in art, the masterpieces around it. An old warrior from the 1650s by a follower of Rembrandt is an extraordinary example of aging that for me is a dichotomy, and it is dangerous, and it asks a series of questions that we can't necessarily answer, but it very much challenges prejudice for me. One of the first being that this piece is entitled An Old Warrior. Now that title is about 100 years old, we would suggest. It's a fairly recent title. It may not be contemporary to the piece, but what is fascinating about this work is that the warrior is depicted to us in old age. He's not vital. He's not in the prime of life. He's not muscular. He's not depicted in combat. He's not depicted as in any sense of valiancy or action or dynamism. Instead, what we find is a figure that's very much cocooned in this dark landscape, and the chair that he occupies, the darkness and the depth of the background renders him almost smaller and more vulnerable. And that vulnerability is, for me, advanced by the fact that he's seated. He's not active or moving around. He's cocooned and ensconced in the chair. And also notice that he doesn't look at us or connect to us. He's impassive to our presence. He may not even know that we're there. He's looking away from us. Therefore, we're looking at him and objectifying him as an object. There is no connection. There is no challenge back to me on this piece. He's invited by the follower of Rembrandt to be objectified, I would argue. Now, this figure, we believe, could have been a depiction of a real soldier. Alternatively, he could have been a depiction, or intended to be a depiction, of the god Mars, as framed within 17th century Dutch culture and fashions. And that plays out in terms of the characterization that I can see in terms of this piece. Look at the treatment of the hair, for example, and the light that comes down on top of the head, but bathes this figure, the creases, the wrinkles. This follower of Rembrandt is deliberately enjoying and fully immersed in the virtuosity that comes with drawing and painting aging skin. There is an extra challenge associated with it. The texture is far more complicated. Therefore, the artist can show themselves in a different light, or show themselves using light in different ways. And that's picked up on in this piece. Look how the creases around the eyes and the jowls and the wave of the hair is caught. And the wave of the hair is extraordinary, because in hues of silver working back to browns and possibly golds, we see a hint of the youthful colour that once was in the hair, but now that salt and pepper has taken over. The figure, though, is presented to us as a warrior, and I can see that in terms of the clothing. So that collar that you can see, for example, is called a gorget. It's designed to protect you in battle from attacks to your neck. Similarly, look at the treatment of the jerkin. Is it wax leather? Is that shining on the depiction of metal, for example? But the virtuosity of light is extraordinary in this piece. Look how it shines back down his back or on the sides of his arms. This piece glows with life and vitality. But simultaneously, it invites us to question the nature of the sitter. And as we go deeper into this, I find that. Do we find an active warrior, or is the invitation to pity and objectify this figure there based on their age? That they are defined as a warrior by the title, yet they are no longer able to fight as they did or defend themselves as they did. That we see somebody armed for battle, yet simultaneously incapable, arguably, of battle based on their age. The physicality of this figure is startling. Look at the treatment of the hand, for example, on the right. This is a very strong hand. This figure is a figure made of battle. This is a figure made of to be active. Yet there's a strange tension in this piece. Am I to admire the figure, or am I invited to pity the figure based on their lack of youth, their lack of vitality? The follower of Rembrandt is deliberately drawing attention to age to make a point, and that point is really, really difficult to navigate. Because for me, the point is about, is the figure consensual in this conversation that we're having? Absolutely not. Secondly, is this figure presented to us for our judgment and our presumption about what age is? Is this a sad story because the warrior is no longer on the battlefield and defending himself? Or is this a story of dignity and of a long life lived, and the fact that this figure retains the identity of a warrior? Age has not removed that identity. This man is a warrior, as demonstrated by the clothing that he's wearing, his attitude, and his presenting to us. There's a couple of telltale hints within the piece as well that talk to me about the nature of time and erosion going on in this piece. And it's in the gorget, it's in the collar. So on the zoom that we've got on the screen at the moment, I can see a sheen of polished metal. But simultaneously, I'm questioning, is that rust that I can see as well? Is it wear? Is it degradation? Is this old armor that the figure is wearing, or is it new? There is such a tension and a battle here about how we approach this figure. Do we admire this figure, or do we patronize this figure based on their age? And I think for me, it's about admiration. When I consider the nature of the society that this figure lived in. Now, if this was Mars, it talks about a larger tradition of male dominance, strength, Greek heroism. But if it also talks about 17th century identity, then this is remarkable for the warrior. So as this was painted in the decade this was painted in the 1650s, the 80-year Dutch War of Independence, or Dutch War, it was just coming to its end. Successive generations had been in violent conflicts to find independence within the Dutch nation and Dutch identity. The entire country had effectively been weaponized for 3 generations. And this played out into a wider conversation that was happening in 17th century Europe around the 100 Years' War that was happening as well. People would have lived and died growing up in war and battle. So to see this figure is to see a national identity weaponized. It's to see possibly masculinity weaponized. This figure represents more than age, I would suggest. This figure represents to me a sense of martial law within a state attacking and or defending itself. Now, that the figure exists in this context, I think is amazing, because to live to this advanced age as a warrior would mean success. It would mean that you survived battle, that you were victorious. How many others could say that within a culture that was for nearly a century that was at war with other figures in Europe? To also consider age within this piece is to consider the nature of what a soldier and a soldier's life would have been. Now, we're presuming a level of age on this figure based on, for example, sunken eyes, sunken cheeks, creases around the face, grey hair, all the presumptive signifiers to say that this person has reached an advanced age. But that may not necessarily be the case in what we define as an advanced age. Bear in mind that life expectancy now versus in the 17th century is markedly different. They had far shorter, more brutal, pressing physical lives that involved exertion and damage and toil. Labour, hardship would prematurely age a body. And furthermore, to see someone reaching an advanced age in the 17th century would not be as common as it is today by any stretch of the imagination. So to see the elderly figure was far more marked and far more of a statement. There were simply less elderly figures than there are today. Therefore, to have an elderly identity or an aging identity becomes far more marked, and the baggage that it carries is extraordinary and moving. But what really gets me in terms of the composition is that this figure is looking away from us, and I'm making the decisions, I'm judging this figure, and how much of that judgment comes from growing up in a society that talks about the elderly as less than, that talks about aging as a process by which we lose and or are removed from society. And I think this challenges that. This figure is still the warrior. He is and is defined as a warrior. And even if we remove the title of this work, he retains a martial identity. There's that martial identity at odds with to age. Then again, we're challenging this notion of aging as weakness. Yeah, I see strength. If this is Mars, the god, for example, it's a mature Mars. It's a Mars that is lost in thoughts or memory or reflection. And I think this zoom in on the face for me really gets that, because this figure is not connecting with us. This figure is not looking at us. This figure is not acknowledging our presence, because our presence is not necessary to this figure. This figure is lost in a haze of memory and remembrance. So many emotions could be dancing across this face. Is that resignation? Is it withdrawal? Is it sadness? Is it loss? Or is it a stiff dignity that is coming across inside of this figure? The nuance and the expression of emotion, and how many different emotions for me are at play within this figure, talk to me about a dynamism of the expression of age, and that age does not dull our identities, does not dull our lived experience. If anything, it enhances it. And his age for me is a catalyst to consider, what is he thinking about? What is this figure considering? Is this figure considering past battles, past victories, a long life lived? There is a real emotional intelligence happening inside of this piece that speaks beyond the objectification of a figure locked in a chair or in a darkened room, and instead talks to me about a space where this man, this figure, this artwork is beyond that, and that we can find deeper readings and we can find identity in a character that may not even be real because he's a study. But I think the follower of Rembrandt has found something really, really useful and powerful inside of that. I would absolutely love to know what you think of this piece. Have you got any questions? Have you got any reflections on what it means? I think this is a really good time to throw over to you, Becca.
Oh yeah, so we've had one reflection through the Q&A so far, Jon, and I'll read it for you now. I think what's interesting is that as people move into old age, society can lose sight of who they are and of who they were in their prime. This piece reminds us of who he was in his youth. I see it as a story of dignity, but a reminder that it is important to remember there is a life lived behind what we see when we look at older adults.
Absolutely. And that's one of the challenges inside of this piece as well, that if the artist has invited us to pity this state, or we are expected to pity this state, it doesn't account for the power and the gravitas that this figure has. It's an extraordinary scene. And we know that Rembrandt himself chronicled his entire life and aging process in his own portraiture. Therefore, his followers would have been exposed to somebody that was not only keenly conscious of aging, but was aware of the depiction of aging. He didn't focus on the fountain of youth, for example, as Rubens did, who you'll find in the Barber collection as well, that everyone is cherubic and healthy and young and beautiful. Instead, as Rembrandt ages and as Rembrandt goes through varying levels of pain and loss and changes within his life, imagine the impression that is on his followers as well. And I feel that in terms of the warrior. The warrior is not a two-dimensional person for me. The warrior is carrying so much baggage, and with that baggage comes dignity and gravitas that I think is beautiful.
Absolutely. I wonder if when you were researching this talk, Jon, you came across any other similar works that reference maybe military or old age at all?
There's a number in the Barber collection specifically. There's a number of depictions of the elderly. I think they tend to either be biblical though, or they tend to lean towards what's known as a peasant narrative, whereby it's the humble worker in the field and a life lived of service. Whereas I think finding a piece that talks about aggression and violence, and this is a concept and a piece that talks about aggression and violence. This isn't a benign elderly gentleman by any stretch of the imagination. If he is a warrior, and if he was a successful warrior, he would have taken people's lives. The things he would have seen in terms of his landscape, and more importantly, the figures that he was based on, contemporary old warriors that would have been aplenty as the war finished in that culture. Very much like in the First and Second World War, when the UK, for example, there was a sudden proliferation in terms of our culture of seeing war veterans and amputees, for example, in society. To see that figure would not be a benign token of age by any stretch of the imagination. I think for me, rather, it would be something really quite scary, because you would imagine, what has that person seen? What has that person done? War is horrific. 17th century war was protracted and bloody and dangerous and intense in a way that no modern conflict could ever imagine. Therefore, I don't see a safe figure when I'm looking at this gentleman. I see someone that potentially has taken life and is violent, and that it's not dulled with age as far as I'm concerned. This figure may still have literal blood on his hands.
We have a couple more comments and questions coming in. Amy says, as we don't know the identity of the artist, we can only speculate. But do you think that this artist was older themselves at the time of painting this?
I think so, because I think there is a, and it's quite difficult to articulate. So please excuse me. I'll say it out loud and see how it sounds. I think that particularly for younger sitters who have less experience of the physicality of age, or have been around people that have the physicality of age, I think it's difficult to depict without overdoing it necessarily, or making the creases too deep, the wrinkles too pronounced. The temptation almost, if you have less experience of older age, is to produce a cartoonish version of what that state might be based on a lack of information or awareness. Whereas this figure strikes me as incredibly strong and robust. It may have been painted from life. I think the virtuosity is extraordinary. I think to achieve that level of detail in terms of the gradient of the hair going from grey to browns to the kind of the honey colours, I think is incredible. I think I would argue, and again, this is speculation, I don't know and we'll never know. I would argue the intent here is more to demonstrate virtuosity of light, and that the figure and their creases and the texture of age is an added challenge and an added way of proving yourself in terms of artistic virtuosity. But I think it would involve a character. I think I'd be very surprised if the follower of Rembrandt who painted this had not seen an old soldier within the society that they were in, at least.
It does look so realistic in terms of the representation of the sitter, but also, like Annette says here, the leather on the arm looks almost bloomed, which fits with your idea of a rusted old battle dress. So thinking about the textures, I was there, but also Annette's making a mention about the way in which the painting's aged as well.
And the palette picks up on that. It's a very melancholic palette. It's not bright, extravagant colours, blooms. Everything feels faded. Everything feels darker. There is a murkiness about it. And we know that Rembrandt and followers of Rembrandt were capable of extraordinary bursts of colour. But there's also a conversation for me around national colours, whether that be artistic styles or religion. So Dutch Protestantism, for example, was a very heavy feature. And you'll find that in the Barber collection, with artists like Flink, for example, or Hans, I forgot the second name. Hans, I'll remember it, the man holding a skull. And and the idea of the dark palette, that Dutch people wore darker clothes with lighter ruffs. The colours associated with Protestantism were blacks and whites. It was very stark. It was very plain. It was deliberately pious. And I think I pick up on that in terms of this. There is a very strong Dutch identity in terms of the palette. And that Dutch identity as well that Rembrandt cultivates of the cocoon-like interior, that everything is dark and slightly musty somehow. I pick up on that, and when I think about the rust on the gorget, or the potential for rust on the gorget, there's also a conversation around melancholy with the depiction and the colours. It feels sad, it feels musty to me. Why isn't this gentleman wearing the most up-to-date clothes? Why isn't he wearing something sparkling? Why isn't he in his regimentals or looking amazing or wearing dress clothes? Because he's ready for battle. This isn't a vanity project. This is literally an old soldier. The one concession to comfort, I would argue, is that lovely soft red velvet chair that he's in. And that's a narrative in itself. He's not on a bench, he's not stood up. He's in a really comfy, lovely chair.
We've got about 3 more questions. Are you happy to have 3 more?
Yeah. And then I think we'll take a break if that's cool.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question is, I wondered if you would call the 2 pictures we have seen so far portraits, and if you could say something about this with respect to objectification and or generalization.
Yes, I would class them as studies, but they are very much portraits to me. And I think we should very much use them and treat them as portraits. I think the distinction between a study, I think often when we're talking about objectification, is often a loophole for people's morality in terms of the pieces, that because it's not someone real or based on a real person, you can take more liberties, you can be more brutal. If I criticize them, if I'm abusive towards them, if I mock them, I've got, there's no moral culpability because it's not a real person. I'm just mocking an idea. And I think in terms of objectification, I think historically some people really do fall through that loophole. I think it's much harder to look someone in the face and be critical or objectify or suggest to them that the nuance of an incredibly long life is 2D and cute to you, versus a study, which is an everyman and it scoops up the best of that trope. It scoops up the best of the visual identity, but it doesn't give you the emotional culpability to deal with what's happened, and that I'm not attacking someone. I don't need to say sorry. I don't need to feel guilty about objectifying them, and I certainly don't need to research and find out about their life because it's not a real person. And I think that's doubly so in terms of us not knowing if it's a real sitter, and then it's an unnamed follower of Rembrandt. I think throughout the century, I think he had about 54 different followers across his different lifespans and the different careers. And also, as his fortunes waned, the level of apprenticeship disappeared as well. It's such a slippery piece that I think it invites objectification because there's nobody to argue back. There's no one to advocate for this. And there's no history or sociology behind it to defend it. That's objectification for me.
Fantastic answer. I hope that's satisfied that question. Another one here. Does these works that we've been talking about reflect a greater interest in naturalism and biology or anatomy at the time?
I would say yes, definitely, because I think we've left the vogue of 16th century projection in terms of art, which is very flat, very ornamental, sparkling to present ourselves at our very best. But the features are almost indistinguishable from the clothing or the background. Everything is designed with artifice in mind. And I think I would suggest portraits of 16th century monarchy, for example, is a really good example of that. Portraits that we've got in national collections of Elizabeth I. I've got absolutely no idea what she looks like, but I know that she was powerful. And I think when we consider other artists in the collection like Van Dyck, they become these huge watermarks in the 16th, 17th century, where suddenly humanism evolves and these big swathes of smoky realism and flushes of health start to come through in terms of the sitters. And I find that extraordinary because it's been a very short space of time and in a very short era that the shift happens. And I think if we're talking about anatomy as well, there's an interesting conversation around the volume of bodies available to be anatomized in the 17th century, and how a number of people, for example, held or kept skulls or had biological systems studied because progressive forces were at play in terms of church versus learning, and that was happening in disintegration of social hierarchies that were in the 16th century. So to suddenly see a deeper awareness of the human form, I think speaks volumes about how quickly the 17th century was matching societal change brought on by violence, which again takes us back to the notion of the warrior. Who better to talk about 17th century identity than somebody that was affected by 17th century violence?
Very interesting, thank you. The last point, I see dignity in the old soldier, but I also see it in the old lady. I think we're referencing the first work that you showed us. Are you not being a bit unfair to her?
Yes, and I agree with you. And I think that is a conversation on objectification in itself. To me, to use the piece at Wolverhampton as a counterbalance, or to say that it's less than the works in the Barber collection because it depicts that, is objectification in itself. And I think you're absolutely right. It's unfair to do so. It's a curated narrative that I'm putting forward. I haven't included, for example, how positively welcomed a piece like that would be. How, you know, financially and or commercially, these pieces flew and continue to fly. There is still a market for that chocolate box, that warmth. And I think it talks to me about there is a nuance in terms of approach, and that to say something is sickly sweet shouldn't be to remove the joy and the pleasure and the warmth and the comfort of that lady. And I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you. It is doing that work a disservice. I've used it as a counterbalance because I think for me personally, in terms of me viewing it, it goes slightly too far down that scale and it becomes slightly sickly to me in terms of sentimentalism. And I think maybe that's the crux of it, that I can retain a sense of dignity and respect for the lady, but not necessarily the treatment, which I find possibly too sentimental for me to connect with. That if everything is so Brady Bunch, I can't see myself anymore and I lose that emotional connection. I like a bit of light and dark. I like a giggle and then a cry. And that doesn't give me crying, it just gives me giggles. So, but I agree with you.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fantastic point to end on before we go to the break. How long are we on break for, John?
Should we take 5 minutes and then come back? Take a time to stretch your legs, go to the toilet, brew another cup of tea. I'll be here for you.
Thank you. I'm just putting the work that John mentioned by Frans Hals in the chat now. That's in the Barber's collection.
Frans Hals, thank you. I totally went blank on that.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you all so much for coming, by the way. It really means the world to me that I get to share this art with you, and in times where we're still very distant from each other, that we get to connect. So thank you so much for being here. We'll get started in 3 minutes time. So I very much hope you've got tea. If you've got biscuits, grab them. It's got to be done. So again, we'll do another piece. As I'm talking, as I'm sharing my feelings and my readings on this piece, please do send through yours, questions, comments, emotions. It really brings the space alive. And we'll be back in 2 minutes time. I hope you're all right, by the way. I'd give you a hug, but COVID, you know. And that's our 5 minute mark. So if you're comfortable and if you're ready, I'm going to move on to the next piece that I'm going to be exploring, which is titled Portrait of an Identified Widow, but it's not. We do know who it is. It's Mrs. Harriet O'Nions, mother of Lady Barber, the founder of the Barber Institute of Fine Art. And this piece is by Nestor Cambier. Cambier has captured a woman at a moment of crisis. So the widow is recently widowed. We know this because Victorian mourning practices, which presumably this lady is following, are elaborate and extraordinary. Now, what strikes us as an Edwardian image isn't. This was painted in the 1920s. It really doesn't strike us as what you'd expect from the 1920s, either in vogue or also in terms of fashion. This doesn't sit comfortably with the roaring 20s and the beauty and the flappers and what we'd expect, because this woman would have lived through the Victorian era and the Edwardian era. She retains that sense of dress. But Victorian and Edwardian mourning practices were out on their way out in the early 20th century, but still very much a force and still very much practiced by people that experienced that. One of them being that you had to plunge yourself into deepest mourning, and mourning that was codified and stratified based on your class. Now, we know that this lady presented to us is very wealthy. We can tell, firstly, by the clothing, and secondly, by the fact that Cambier painted her. Thirdly, by the fact that we know she was the wife of a prominent industrialist in Birmingham, an industrialist that made a huge amount of money, and who in turn, her daughter married the other founder of the Barber Institute. So this piece is very, very close to home in terms of the art collection at the Barber Institute. Mourning clothes would have been codified very, very strictly. There was a set strata of weeks and months and days, possibly after widowhood, whereby you could wear different clothing and express yourself in different ways. So, for example, she feels and looks to us slightly monastic or like a nun almost in terms of how she's presented to us, yet she's obeying the rules and institutions as laid out for the widow. And expected for the widow in terms of aging and age as well. Now, the figure is wearing an enormous wide-brimmed hat, high collar, but then can you see the touch of fur that lines her, and the fact that she's wearing jet beads as decoration? There is a conscious depiction of that this woman is in deepest mourning, Yet there is a characterization that starts to come through in terms of her fashion sense, her dignity, what she likes, how she wants to present herself to the world. She wants to be comfortable, she wants to be warm, she wants to be seen as being of wealth and fashion. That bow on her hat, for example, is ornamental. It offers no function. Simultaneously, the voluminous veil that's pulled back over the hat of deep dark jet black is not necessarily functional. It is a statement of fashion or intent of what is going on with this character. So already the idea that the two-dimensional figure of the elderly is just cute and simple and plain is chopped away by the fact that this lady is consciously projecting to us identity, curated identity through her fashion sense, curated identity through her widowhood, and how she's matching societal expectation of how it was understood that the elderly widow would be. There is a huge gravitas, though, in terms of the depiction of this lady, which is startling and absolutely leaps out to me. Now, this piece is really difficult to interpret, partly because there is a colour bloom or fading on the work, and it occurs in a number of Cambier's portraits and the works that Cambier did. Somewhere in the production of them, somewhere in the painting, Cambier has applied a technique whereby either the canvas or the work themselves has changed colour over time, or there's a slight degradation on the canvas itself. So we can't rely that these were the colours that Cambier intended. They may have been, but we can't necessarily rely on them. What it does leave us, though, with is the portrait as it is now and the characterization that we'd read now. If I didn't know, for example, this surface bloom was affecting the artwork and it had been through conservation, I wouldn't be doubting the colour changes and the depiction of colour within this piece. I'd be taking it at face value. But that use of colour is striking. Again, the figure is presented to us for objectification. She's looking away from us. The light is bathing down on her. It is again catching wrinkles and creases, but in a very elegant manner. It hints at and reflects a level of age, but isn't explicit in terms of its detail. And I think that's very a telltale sign, I would suggest, of Cambier in terms of his style. Now, Cambier as an artist is not widely known. He was commercially very available and he worked a lot. So the Barbers, for example, loved him. You'll find a number of portraits in the Barber collection of Lady Barber that is painted by Cambier, and it exudes glamour and confidence. And it's very of its time, very early 19th century, very Edwardian glamour. He's very favourably compared to the artist John Singer Sargent, for example. And I think that's the key. He's compared favourably to a larger artist, but we don't necessarily know too much about this artist. We know that he was resident at Culham Court as the guest of Lady Barber when he came over to paint her for numerous occasions. So conceivably, this could have happened at the same time whereby the mother was painted, or this whole composition has come about as a result of Lady Barber commissioning this piece, but we simply don't know. What we do know is that Cambier as an artist is often overlooked, and the Barber Institute of Fine Art is one of the few places that have done large-scale exhibitions of Cambier's works. You'll find them very scattered and proliferated in private collections or on online markets. But what Cambier has done here is extraordinary, and it speaks of a connection to a family, and it speaks of a connection to a sitter. Has he worked hard to flatter this sitter? Has he worked hard to create an artificial image of this sitter, of grandeur? I would say yes in terms of the clothing, but again, we've got so many similarities with the first piece that we looked at by Rembrandt. The palette is dark, the colour and light shines down from the top. She's again cocooned in these velveteen dark spaces, but the face emerges, and the face emerges with such emotional intensity. It's really, really difficult to read. When I zoom in on this face, things really start to come alive for me. So first and foremost, we can see the surface damage and the bloom coming through. You can start to see the hairs and the little feathers of the canvas working themselves through. So this is post-conservation. So a lot of work has gone into presenting it at its best. But yet still, when I look at these eyes, extraordinary. Look at the colour of the eyes. They are not white and bright. Now, the face is this dignified mask of control, but that control belies eyes that are incredibly sensitive. Look, for example, at the slight ruckle at the top of her nose, on her brow. Look, for example, at the placement of the eyes. Look, for example, at that watery blue that's coming through in the eyes, and that yellowing, slightly brown tinge of the whites of the eyes that's happening. Now, whether by accident or design, we're presented with a figure that is incredibly sensitive, deeply emotive, at one hand trapped in a sense of class and Edwardian early 20th century control and magnificence, but yet at the other hand, a figure that is deeply sensitive when we get to these eyes. What are these eyes telling us, and what are these eyes telling you? I see possibly a pain, a weariness, a resignation. Is it the surface bloom that has caused that slight brown in the eyes, or has it been crying and pain and withdrawal? Withdrawal is a factor in Edwardian early 20th century mourning practices. For example, you were expected to spend large amounts of time away from people and away from society. You were not supposed to mix with people. You were not supposed to go out. Your contact was supposed to be very, very limited. At a time when arguably you most need people in terms of grief, and then add layers on top of that of increased risk of isolation and alienation that comes with age, you're in a position where you're forced to be without people and you're forced to be on your own. Cambier, for me, captures that in terms of the eyes, the dignity of that tight lip and the pursing of the cheeks and the elegant fold of the cheeks versus the description and the story that's going on in terms of these eyes. This is a woman that is exhibiting incredibly rich emotional dynamism. But that dynamism for me is captured in the eyes, and it is almost trapped in the eyes. She's telling a story by how she's looking out. But again, we're looking at her. She's not looking at us. So we've got that conversation that reoccurs from the first piece in terms of objectification versus how comfortable do we feel uplifting and raising the dignity of this piece? Are we invited to pity this figure because firstly, she's in mourning, therefore she's lost someone close to her. But secondly, again, to invite that age is an object to be seen, to be used, to be judged? Or are we looking at the crafted depiction of intense mourning framed within dignity? And I think there is a real telltale tension that's happening between that. The eyes and the face, the pain that's happening there versus the expression of control. When we get really up close, and one of the beautiful things about doing online seminars that I found is that whilst I very much miss being with you physically, being with the pieces physically, and being in the Barber itself, we've got such greater access in terms of the digital. We couldn't get this close in real life, where you'd have to really press your face up. And to get this close to the piece for real talks about a level of physical and financial privilege that you can afford to and can get to the Barber and its collections. Whereas using the digital versions of them, we lose the physicality of it, but I get to be up close and show you the damage, but also the melancholy that it comes through this piece. Again, there is almost a decay to this piece, a wearing, a weathering of this piece that talks of a larger narrative about the aging of the sitter as well. The piece is not pristine, it is wearing down. Therefore, the figure itself is wearing down as well. To be this close, to see the canvas, to see the brushstrokes, talks about a quickness for me. This was a study done rapidly, I would suggest. It is not a figure that is deeply composed. I think also the background is nearly non-existent in terms of scenery. So she again is cocooned. Our focus is on her and our focus is on the individuality of her. But she is not 2D by any stretch of the imagination, which is, I would argue, what ageism does to people. As I get very close to the image, I start to find a dignity and a tension on that dignity that belies aging. Aging, for example, that indicates that beyond a certain lived experience, beyond a certain lifespan, you will start to lose people. You will start to be aware of loss or mourning or mortality. And I think we've caught a woman in the midst of that conversation, not only with us as the viewer, but also ourselves. As I look into those watery eyes, I see incredible presence of a woman at a huge turning point and change in her life, that being that she's just lost her husband. But to mark that moment artistically is a statement in itself. Why would you capture yourself in mourning? Why would you picture yourself in mourning? Why would you do that? Why would you want to record that moment? And I think it speaks of the will of the sitter. It speaks of a sitter that is very much aware of and conscious of a change in their social dynamics. That to be a widow and to be elderly in a society in the early 20th century that arguably does not value it, or you lose a sense of independence as a result of it, is a turning point and a crux in their life. She is not young anymore. She is not making the decisions that she could make in youth. And I think being captured in this portrait, she's fossilized in a moment of intense vulnerability that comes with age. Do we pity that? Or do we see it as a moment of dignity and strength? For me, it's very much dignity and strength. The will to curate yourself, to project yourself, to push out of a social conditioning that tells you that the elderly are sidelined, that to be a widow means you have to withdraw yourself temporarily from society, I think is a really powerful statement, because she's putting herself forward. And very much in the same way, when you look at depictions of Lady Barber, she's joyful, she's grand, she's glamorous, she's enjoying herself. This piece radiates pain. And that pain is three-dimensional. It defies aging for me, or that the widow is impassive to her state, because she's making conscious decisions. She's making conscious decisions to be depicted, how she's depicted, and the nature of who depicts her. And I think these eyes, I keep going back to that moment. Look at the treatment of the eyes versus the framing around the face. It's incredible, and it's so emotionally complex. There is an inherent vulnerability in this piece, because we're looking at somebody grieving. We're looking at somebody that is looking away from us and is lost in memory. What is she considering? What she's lost, who she's lost, past memories? Or is she considering the next phase of her life as a widow, and what it means to be a widow, what it means to be aging in a society that arguably isn't set up or will not accept the dynamics and the nuance of that condition? She's fighting back. There is a strength, but then that strength is tempered by the imploring almost in the eyes, heavy lidded, looking away from us. No connection with me, no connection with what I think or feel about her. Yet a moment is marked, and a moment is powerfully marked with dignity and with respect and with control. This is not a victim. This is not somebody that is prone to outside forces. She is curating herself and her image at a moment of transition. There is strength, there is determination, there is class recognition in her face, with the expected dignity of Victorian mourning, possibly the British stiff upper lip, versus the vulnerability and pain that I find resting within these eyes. It's extraordinary and moving and complex. And that complexity, I would argue, is often removed by ageism, that the elderly are simply incapable of such emotional depth, that they will be happy with what they have, that a bag of Werther's originals equals happiness. And it's so deeply divisive and painful. And anyone that has been exposed to ageism or been around ageism can feel how visceral and how much the injustice of that burns, that emotional and intelligence is somehow removed in this cocoon of all I see is your physical form and all I see is your age. And I would argue that this piece is a counterbalance to that. It is somebody with the means and the expression to deliberately demonstrate what is happening to them with emotional intelligence, very much in the same way the warrior did so. However, the old warrior is unnamed by the unnamed follower. We don't know if they're real or based on somebody else. This is a real person. We're looking somebody in the eye. And I think it really goes back to that amazing question that we had before around objectification. It's far harder to look Harriet O'Nian's In the Eye an objectifier than it is to objectify the aging warrior or the old warrior. But this piece is extraordinary in its virtuosity that brings that up. And it's a very little known piece, I would argue, in terms of the collection. Again, when you go to the Barber Institute, you are faced with a treasure trove of European and world-class masterpieces. But it's the smaller stories that's happening in the collection that talk to me about aging, about the reality of aging, and also the privilege of being able to capture that aging in person. I think this is a really good moment to throw over for questions.
Thank you, John. Such a beautiful talk. It's beautiful as well to be able to see those close-up images. I'm missing the collection so much after a year of not being there myself. And just some beautiful phrasing that I've written down here, that the pain is three-dimensional, powerfully marked with dignity. Really, really beautiful phrasing there from John. Thank you so much. We have got some comments and questions to share with you as well. Particularly sensitive reflection from Diane in Oxford, who says that they are a chair of an art group whose members are mostly aged 70 to 95. Some are good artists, but we cannot meet in person just now. And what people miss is meeting for a cup of tea and a chat. If the first painting was done right now, it would depict isolation and loneliness, as so many elderly people do not feel comfortable with our digital connection.
What an incredibly beautiful sharing. Thank you so much. That's a real gift for me. Made me feel a bit emotional. The idea as well that we're not looking at these pieces through the lenses of when they were made, but we're looking at them right now. So the idea that we're mid or towards the end of the pandemic, and that we're in a society that has coded elderly and or people aging to be at their most vulnerable. So they're carrying these labels of vulnerability, they're carrying these labels of medical fragility. And how much are we projecting that onto the images of the elderly that we see in collections? I would argue it's quite substantial. It's really difficult to distance ourselves from conversations around aging at the moment to conversations around vaccination or shielding. And I think the projection onto these pieces, what a beautiful comment. Thank you so much.
We've got a couple of questions that are sort of linked. One attendee says that this work reminds her of Queen Victoria, who was famously in mourning for decades, and kind of linked to that. Why would someone commission a portrait which depicts the mourning process? Was there a societal pressure at that time?
I would suggest definitely in the cult of Victoria, a lot of people have equated it to the cult of death in terms of the fact that her identity was built around widowhood and that the mourning period was protracted and very, very deep. And I think that speaks of the mental health and the well-being of Victoria. But I think also that imprints itself on a national psyche and that expectation that, well, Victoria was in mourning for half of her life. I really should get into that mourning. And it's really difficult to project that because mourning, grief and loss is such a personal expression and people deal with it in so many different ways. There is no uniform expression of grief, but simultaneously wanting to find personality within that space, wanting to find your identity, wanting to project and record this, I think speaks volumes of what the sitter was going through at that time. I think to monumentalize, to record that emotion, that there are so many times, for example, where you could have yourself painted at times of prosperity or emotional happiness and remember that. Why would you want to remember yourself at a time of acute emotional pain? Because that acute emotional pain is a point by which we can still represent ourselves and still find ourselves. And I would suggest, particularly in a patriarchal society like the early 20th century, when women were simultaneously less than, and therefore the aging was seen as less than, to fight your way past all those layers, to still project emotional intelligence and intent and wealth and privilege, which is exactly what she does, I think is a real mark of character and a real mark of design. And I think for me, I link it to a ferocity of character, coming through at that moment, not the notion of the benign elderly lady that is just going to quietly accept her lot, or that intense emotion is beyond her. Far from it.
Yeah, you can see an intensity in her expression, absolutely. Linked to that, we have a question, as this is a commission, should we take into account that Cambier might have glamorized her appearance?
Yes, and I think the association with Cambier being within likeable to John Singer Sargent, I think really reinforces that the works are aching fantasies of glamour at that period, this vogue of early 19th century Edwardian glamour, that I am aristocratic and of wealth, or I'm an industrialist, therefore I need to project myself in a certain way, and that way absolutely needs to be flawless, I think is key. It goes back to that point that Cambier depicts aging very gracefully. Gracefully might be a nice way of saying deceitfully. Gracefully might be a nice way of saying the omission of the physical details. It allows for a greater sense of glamour. For example, I can't see the sitter's teeth. Does she have good teeth? You know, the conversations around that are denied me because she is achingly glamorous. That hat, it reminds me of that scene in Titanic, you know, where Rose gets out of the car. Like, it's so fashionable. It's so beautiful. The money that would have gone on mourning clothes that you weren't going to wear anymore afterwards. There is a real acute sense of extravagance in terms of that fashion that isn't contemporary with the 20s, when everything was becoming literally quite minimized. She is still excessively glamorous. And I think that is very, very telling.
Yes, but maybe linked to that comment that we had about societal pressure around mourning, and also around Queen Victoria, and this pressure to be a widow in the most extreme sense of the word in this depiction.
Absolutely.
We have another one here. I think John raised the most pertinent point when he said, why did she choose to be painted in this situation? What point was she trying to make?
And that's a really huge one, because if we're talking about objectification of elderly and or aging sitters, it's always on other people's behalf, or it's always possibly at the behest of someone else, or projecting a greater idea. So Mars, for example, in the first one, in After Rembrandt, was a projection of strength. It was about arguably the militarization of their culture. It was about masculinity. It was about the fragility of youth versus age, and yet he's still a warrior. But with this figure in Cambier's piece, we know that she commissioned it. Arguably, her force is just as great as the warrior in terms of the intent and how she chooses to be depicted. And I think to have that commission, whether it be her daughter, her son-in-law, or she was part of that commission directly herself, talks about intent and talks about taking back control. In a number of the Barber collections and a number of the depictions you'll find of the elderly, they aren't necessarily what we could define as consensual, in the sense that people wanted to depict their own age and were conscious agents of saying, this is where I am now and this is how I want to look. They're studies of old age. They're people in old age, or it's old age telling a larger tale or a narrative, whether that be religious, whether it be social, whether it be economic. But here in this moment, arguably we've got an example of someone taking control of that and the objectification that comes with it, and saying, you will not remove or erase my age. I am an active agent in how I'm depicted. My age is part of that.
She's owning it.
Totally. There's such amazing questions, everyone. Thank you so much. You're filling my heart up.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting observations as well. And we've had a few suggestions for other works to look at on this theme that have gone in the chat as well. So if you're interested in those, you can take a look at that. We have got a couple more thoughts, and they're kind of around the display of the work and also the interpretation of it in Barber. First one is, why did she, Her name and her subsequent identity disappear from the painting's title. Is this the gallery's doing so?
A really good question, because when I started my research, it was an unidentified woman. It was only working with the curator and the learning team that I was able to establish her identity. And I think that's really, really interesting, because that for me was one of the initial attractions to the work, her anonymity. Why can't I know who she is? Why can't I see who she is? It can't be for lack of money or lack of power, because she had the money to present herself in such elaborate mourning and such fashionable mourning as well. She looks amazing. So if you've got the agency to present yourself like that, why isn't your name recorded? And I think it's less about erasure, but possibly about the fact that there is a wider societal kind of pressure on the elderly, that they become invisible, that aging is a mark whereby we start to disappear socially. And that plays out in contemporary facts and statistics in terms of aging and isolation and vulnerability and loneliness, which is a real key. Age UK, for example, identified that one of the top criteria of feeling connected with other people and yourself is through creativity and cultural exchanges. And I think that's absolutely key. It's what she's literally doing that in our past, but it's quite easy to forget or omit, because I think we work in a society where the inherent value of the elderly is slightly less than. So it's harder to forget the name of Charles I than it is to forget an elderly sitter. And I think the omission is telling, but I don't think it's deliberate by any stretch of the imagination.
No, yeah, and in a similar vein, there's a question here. Do we know if the sitter and patron wanted the painting to hang? Might the placement of it in the Barber play a part in reading of a sitter as an individual and agent? I have to say that I don't think that this artwork actually is on display. I think it's part of a very small amount of works that are in store at the Barber. And listening to Jon talk about his process and researching for this talk is quite interesting, because perhaps moving online and then looking at online collections and seeing what's visible there is quite a different process to, say, if you'd come to the Barber to have a look around to see what you might want to talk about.
And that plays out in terms of the physical privilege we've got or used to have in terms of accessing the collection. It makes me really sad that I can't ever remember being in the space and seeing that work. It may have been on display, but I never clocked it. I never spent the time with it. I never gave it a chance to connect with me. And it's extraordinary in terms of its depiction of aging and ageism and the emotional nuance of a woman trapped arguably within class, but then bursting with emotion simultaneously, much like the figure in After Rembrandt, trapped in identity of being a warrior, but again bursting with melancholy and emotion. And I think accessing it via the internet, I think, is really, really useful, because it's a level playing field. Whereas when I'm in the Barber itself, I'm automatically drawn to how luminous the grand masters are, or I'll occasionally go I'll do a selfie next to the Van Dyke just because I can. And I think there's more of a level playing field in terms of emotional access, I would suggest, accessing the works online.
And I suppose, do you have any comments about, say, if it were to be displayed, because it probably has been displayed in its time, do you think that would play a part in the reading of the sitter as an individual and an agent?
Definitely. And I think it would be almost intimidating. And I think what's interesting about having it online versus seeing it physically is I know that this was the mother of one of the founders of the Barber Institute, and that Lady Barber's footprint and stamp is enormous in terms of the collection and the building itself. To be in the Barber is to be in a space that is exuberant in terms of Art Deco, but simultaneously quite restrained and British in equal measure. And it could feel austere, but it leans towards warmth more in terms of the building. But I think imagining, because when you walk into the Barber, for example, one of the first things that you'll see is the portrait of Lady Barber, and she's looking incredible and she's looking glamorous, and the dress and the hair, the hat, it's all very, very beautiful. And it elevates the sitter to this point of privilege that is almost unachievable. I'm in your house. You've paid for this. This is your name is on this. And I think the grandeur of seeing a member of her family in that state would really elevate the piece to be something quite, not severe necessarily, but definitely far less achievable emotionally than it is when I look at it on a screen and I get really close up to her eyes. And I think that's the success of Cambier's depiction, that he's achieved the status needed for a member of the Barber family to go on display in the Barber. But simultaneously, he's provided us with so much rich humanism that for me is inescapable when I'm thinking about the depiction of her age and the depiction of the state that she's in at that age in her life. That the artist hasn't smuggled in humanism, it's built in humanism, but it's framed within the grandeur and the beauty of what the Barber is as a whole. Those are just
yeah, wonderful views, and so special as well to have some artworks that are really rarely discussed in the collection and really brought to the forefront by your talk today, Jon. I think that's it for questions.
In which case, would you like me to bring up your slide for the next exhibition?
Yes, please. I also have a poll as well for feedback, so I'm going to launch that poll now. It'd be fantastic if attendees, you wouldn't mind filling out this poll for us about how you found the event today. You can contact Jon, as you can see here, on Twitter and via his email as well. Fantastic picture of you there, Jon, as well.
Very arty.
Yes, we thought this might interest you. We have a real life exhibition happening on site in June, the 11th of June to the 26th of September, Barber Institute of Fine Arts, Making a Mark, Dutch and Flemish drawings from the Royal Collection. So this is our annual exhibition, co-curated with students at the University of Birmingham and the Royal Collection Trust, for an exhibition in our Lady Barber Gallery at the Barber Institute of Fine Arts. Thank you for your votes coming in on the polls. That's fantastic. We've had 4 so far. Thank you. And if any questions do come to you after the event, please feel free to email us with any of your questions. You have our email address from the booking information that we sent to you before the event. And I'm sure Jon wouldn't mind you tweeting as well.
It would be lovely. Always like to make new friends. And we've still got about 5-6 minutes left in the space. So if there's any final questions or reflections that you wanted to put through, otherwise I was going to move towards my conclusion of the session, which is reflective. And I think it's difficult to approach ageism without being combative, or to find it as quite binary. As someone very rightly said, doing a disservice to work that I consider to be quite chocolate box and cute. And I think arguments can be really painful sometimes because there is emotion behind it and there is a depiction of somebody or a state that we're in that we really care about that's being used. But I think for me, using pieces this way talks about a wider sense of social justice. It talks about what happens when we use the collections that are publicly held for us, for our use, as tools for advocacy and democracy. And I think using these 2 pieces for that is absolutely crucial, because in so many conversations where elderly and or aging identity can be omitted or generalizations start to happen, it's really important that we go case by case. It's really important that we do not homogenize conversations around aging. Rather, we use artworks like these 2 as islands of conversation for bigger conversations about how we can put our own identity in. That to homogenize whole swathes of our community just based on age does a massive disservice, because sometimes the only thing we have in common is this, that we're the same age. Life experiences, emotional nuance, what we're going through, how we choose to express ourselves, and a sense of vitality is not uniform. And we find that in these works of art within the Barber Institute. The idea that aging is defined as one category and one visual category of grey hair, looking content, doing something wholesome, for example, or frailty, of physicality, of vulnerability, is wrong, because there are so many versions of strength and dignity. Strength and dignity that are not dependent on our age, but our circumstance, our intent, and what we're going through at that moment. Ageism is cruel, ageism is painful, and ageism is a very quiet prejudice. It bubbles away under the surface. It doesn't shout or advertise itself. It's not necessarily socially acceptable or condemned in equal measure. It seems to exist as a permutation across all levels of society, that people aging and or the elderly may experience discrimination. And I think it's absolutely wrong that we just accept that when we have a treasure trove of art such as the Barber Institute that really asks more questions than it will ever give us answers. But ultimately those questions tell us more about our own attitudes towards aging and ageism than any conversation ever could. And I'm conscious that that conversation has been really biased. You've heard my interpretation based on my research, based on my heart, based on the world I'm living in now and the pieces that I chose. I would actively encourage you to choose your own pieces, build your own story, challenge the narrative in different ways. But this narrative exists around us, and I believe it's something that we need to stand up against.
We have a comment here for you, Jon. Pascal has suggested that it would be interesting to hear you talk on this subject in, say, 20 years, Jon.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very conscious that my perspective reflects that I am 41, but my perspective also reflects that I am a carer. So there's a duality happening here. But one of the things that I'm always very proud of is my activism, and that I use my art investigations to make a stand on things that I believe in. But if I live another 20 years, I very much hope my opinions change, and I very much hope my readings change. And one of the things I love about the Barber Institute is that I'm aging with the works on the walls. A 19-year-old me was looking at those artworks. 25-year-old me was looking at those artworks. Me in my mid-30s was looking at those artworks. And me in my early 40s was looking at those artworks. And I'm aging and I'm evolving and I'm growing along with these pieces.
Well, I hope we do all benefit for another 20 years, Jon, from you looking at this collection.
Fingers crossed. I mean, with enough coffee. But thank you so much. We've got about 4 minutes left in the session. So if anyone's got any final questions or reflections, I'm here. But otherwise, I've got nothing but gratitude for you spending your time with me, and the kindness and the incredible sharing that you've offered on these artworks. I feel really, really lucky, and you've made my heart very happy. Thank you.
We've had some lovely comments for you, Jon, about the session. Brilliant, passionate and articulate, so impressed. Love this talk, Jon. Thank you very much. From Lee. Amy says, thank you very much. You're such an engaging speaker, Jon. It's been really rewarding to consider these works in such detail. Jill says, thank you very much for today. And Diane over in Oxford, who shared that beautiful reflection earlier on, says, thank you. I hope I can visit the Barber myself one day. Beautiful paintings.
They are incredible. And if you do get the chance to go, it's incredible. And the atmosphere that's there and the warmth and how the staff bring you in and make you feel that you're part of the collection is incredible. But simultaneously, the website is a treasure trove of information and images. And if you want to daydream or explore or research, I'd heartily recommend having a wander around mentally on the website. There's some really nice blogs and some podcasts as well that talk about the works. And shameless plug, I've done a podcast about this as well, if you'd like to listen to me again.
Yeah, there are a number of podcasts that talk around this theme actually. It's our Tuesday Talk series that you can visit on our website under the learning section. You're welcome to go and listen to those. Good thing to listen to while you're cooking the dinner or walking the dog. Thank you so much, Jon. A big thank you from us at the Barber it's been fantastic hosting you with us again online. One of our first online events was with Jon, so it's wonderful to have you back again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Right.
Any final questions, fire them through. Otherwise, I'm afraid the space will be closing in 2 minutes' time.
If you haven't voted on the poll already, we'd really appreciate it if you could do that. Fantastic. There's a link coming through on the chat as well to that podcast series if you would like to listen to any of those.
Yeah, I'll move seamlessly from after Rembrandt to beans on toast after this. Yeah, please do support my